We human beings have taken over the whole planet, but now we must learn to share it, or else we will lose it. We have to outgrow tribalism, patriarchy, all our old ways, and we have to move fast, because we're running out of time. I've always enjoyed a good revolution, so kitchens are an interesting place to be these days. This is where the basic power balance between men and women is being renegotiated at last, and if we get it right, the whole human race will be the winner. Most males behave quite decently as individuals, but when human beings get together in large groups, we behave very badly. Wars, tyranny, the huge gulf between rich and poor, north and south, and all those things are directly connected with the imbalance of power between men and women. Male domination is right at the heart of what's wrong with mass civilization.
Whether you're one of the celebrities in town getting the red carpet treatment, or just one of the hundreds of thousands of everyday people who want to partake in this inaugural celebration, everybody, and I mean everybody's, going to get a great show. In the nation's capital, I'm Lynn Blades, reporting.
Today, America is inaugurating a new president, and all the old hopes for peace and justice and equality are having an outing. But compared to its stated ideals, the United States is a grave disappointment. America's militarized up to its eyeballs, and it spent much of its history fighting wars on other people's territory: Native Indians, Mexicans, Filipinos, Vietnamese. Whole classes of its own citizens have spent generations at the back of the bus, and even now not one of its 42 presidents has come from the female majority of the population.
Well, I will go talk to Congressman Brown and
Elizabeth Furs has just surprised herself by being elected to Congress from Oregon. She doesn't fit the mold, and not just because she's a woman. She's also been a full-time peace activist for years, and last year she earned less than the minimum wage.
House meets at 11. Goodbye, lovey. Have fun, you and Barbara Streisand. My God, and I get to, guess what I get to do? Another reception. Oh, my hero!
I'm so happy you're here.
Susie, this is a thrill.
This reception is for all the women who were elected to Congress in 1992. There were almost twice as many of them as ever before.
Thank you. We'll follow your record.
Nice to see you.
Elizabeth Furs glad hands the crowd like any traditional politician. But she's not.
You're having a good time? Don't stand up, please. It is time for those of us who have been disempowered in many ways, who felt that we're on the outside of the mainstream, to understand that, in fact, we can be incredibly powerful. Okay, I need my Senator, I have looked forward to this moment.
Yes, I have too.
I think this is a very male institution here. You know, when the 103rd Congress came in, and we're of color, we're women, it's a marvelous group of people. But once we got into the whole of the Congress, I suddenly realized how few of us there really were. Less than 10% is female. You look at those portraits in the rotunda, and somebody from outer space would say, this is a country made up of white men. And there's no women or people of color in those statues. It's manifest destiny writ large. We just wipe out parts of our history.
The founders of the American Republic were trying to escape from the evils of the past. They thought all they had to do was create a democracy. They didn't realize that the pattern of violence and oppression was part of civilization itself. Now we do, and we even have a name for it: the patriarchal order. king or emperor gives the orders. Those who enforce them have lots of power and privileges. People at the bottom have no rights at all. The poor, slaves, almost all women. And outsiders can just be killed if they get in the way. In fact, American warplanes were bombing Iraq on Inauguration Day.
What I think about now as we play this terrible game of cat and mouse is there are thousands of children dying in Baghdad from the last time we were bombing. What are we doing? When do we begin to say that an Iraqi child's life is the same as the life of a white American? Until we do that, we'll go on having wars.
Americans have been trying to break out of the old pattern for over 2 centuries, and there has been progress. There's no king now, and no slaves, and women have the vote. But hierarchy and violence still rule the world. Men still rule the world. This has been the pattern of our history for so long that many people think it's just human nature, and there's no point in asking a pig to fly. But before we abandon hope, we should be sure whether the patriarchal order is natural or not. And the key evidence for that is not here. It's deeply buried in a different time and place. Human beings have always lived in groups, but up until about 10,000 years ago, in the hunting and gathering times, the groups could behave in a wide range of ways. There were no more than 10 million human beings in the whole world then, but the groups were very small, and how they treated each other depended on circumstances. Rock paintings from Neolithic times suggest that many bands were warlike, with the warrior males running everything. But others did not glorify fighting, and in those bands, men and women were more or less equal. Around 10,000 years ago, the options began to grow narrower. It was probably women who invented agriculture, since gathering plants was traditionally a woman's job. But farming changed everybody's roles and created a new way of doing things all over the world, the village way. People have probably lived on this spot for about 8,000 years, and at the start it would have been what's called an autonomous village. There were no cities yet, no kings, no soldiers, just hundreds of independent villages, each living its own quiet life. And decisions probably still got made the old hunter-gatherer way. Everybody came together and talked things over until they reached a consensus. Hanya Sholkami is an anthropologist, and the villages she studies are in 20th century Egypt. But the economic realities in a village like this have not changed much in thousands of years.
In villages in particular, but I would dare say anywhere, the social fabric would completely collapse without the input of women in economics. Everything to do with the essential day-to-day life of villages must be processed through women. If men cultivate the wheat, it has to be picked over and put through a mill to become flour and then to be processed into bread, which is the lifeline of everyone. The main investment of any rural household, besides the land, is the cattle that they own. This is the women's domain. This also means that women are so central to the home that sometimes they hardly ever leave it. It's the fact that there is so much live capital
Unlike hunter-gatherers, villagers owned things. And to make sure this valuable property stayed in the family, almost all the earliest cultures passed it down through women. Babies have fathers too, and the villagers knew it. Once you've tamed animals, it's obvious that making babies requires a male input. But you can't really be sure which male is the father, while you always know who the mother is. So men's property went to their sisters' children when they died, not to their own. The status of men dropped steeply when human beings settled in villages. Once their value to society had come from their ability as hunters, but the wild game was quickly hunted out near the villages, and when hunting lost its importance, so did the people who used to do it. We don't actually know who sat at the head of the table in the autonomous villages, but we do know that in some places women were buried in the center of the house with the valuable household goods, and men were buried out at the corners with the children. Archaeologists find up to 100 female fertility figures for every male symbol. Fertility was the key to whether the villages lived or died. And fertility was traditionally female magic. Men were never actually oppressed. There was never a matriarchy in that sense. But you can see how men might have felt marginalized in the early village cultures. So what's that got to do with us? Well, first of all, the huge changes that happened when hunter-gatherers settled down in the autonomous villages show just how flexible this thing called human nature is. Male domination isn't natural, and neither is equality of the sexes. It all depends. Same goes for whether we're warlike or peaceful, democratic or authoritarian. Change the way we live, and you may also change the way we behave towards each other. Men were just not very important in the autonomous villages, and people who don't feel important tend to feel resentful instead. You realize, of course, that we're talking about the raw material for a revolution here. And the revolution duly happened, so long ago that it isn't in the history books. But thousands of years later, we can see the results of it all around us. Now women are at the bottom of the pecking order. Men run practically everything, and there's military all over the place. What happened? The Middle East is the best place to look for answers because over half the people on Earth live in cultures that stem from here.
There are various kinds of histories, and the one that got recorded is not the only one, but more importantly, it is the history of the dominant person. It's the dominant group. It is male history. It is the state's history. The archives that I see and the documents that I consult in the Egyptian National Archives down there on the Nile they are documents of state repression, whether they are police records, prison accounts, medical treatises. Now, for important purposes, these are all written by men. Women are excluded, and when they appear in a very marginal way.
Khalid Fahmy studies the history of militarism in Egypt. Today, he's celebrating his doctorate with friends, mostly young scholars who spend their working days trying to piece together other bits of the human puzzle. Huda Lutfi researches the lives of women in medieval Islam. She's a history professor at the American University of Cairo.
Women have always been neglected in history, so not just as a woman, but also as a historian, I'd like to bring out what has been neglected, invisible, silent. I learn a lot from it because it explodes myths. Unfortunately, the sources that I use have been written by men, expressing the patriarchal view of what is important. The army, the state, the bureaucracy, what my students call boring history.
The women Huda studies left no written records, so she looks for clues in the writings of medieval Islamic scholars. Huda figures out what women were really doing from the demands of the male scholars that they stop doing it.
First of all, a woman should go out only for a necessity. If she does, she should go in long and unattractive garments. Sounds familiar. A woman should walk close to the walls of houses in order to make way for men. Men should make the road difficult and narrow for women. As religious scholars, they viewed the female body as threatening to the order of the male world. The nudity of the female body is frowned upon. And this is a very sensitive subject on the part of our religious scholar because he hates women prancing in the public bath, walking around nude, because they exchange domestic news about themselves, about their husbands, and they competed among themselves in terms of, like clothes and jewelry and what did my husband get. It was trouble for the man at home. I always encounter this in my research, about women, that the female body in public space caused chaos. And again, I'm wondering whether this is not also a male retention of the past, when matriarchal power was expressed through the sexuality of the female. When the male revolted against that sexual dominance, he started taming it.
Women's fertility made them powerful in the village times, but those times did not last. Around 5,000 years ago, a great change swept across the world. The era of the autonomous villages came to an end. Nobody really knows why, but in half a dozen places around the world, a new way of living arose. It was the point where human beings stopped just fitting into the world and began to subjugate it. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in China, in Central America, great numbers of villages were united under single rulers. Human beings invented the state, and patriarchy was born at the same moment. All the early states were pyramids of power and privilege with a single man at the top, a pharaoh, a god king, a sacred person. And how could a single man get so much power? Only by terror. The tombs around here belong to the kings and nobles of Egypt's first dynasty. They died about 5,000 years ago, so there's not much left of the tombs now except the outside walls of mud brick. But once the interiors were lined with inlaid cedar and filled with gold and ivory and all manner of precious things. And some of the kings may have been quite decent men when they were alive, but this is what happened when they died. They strangled scores or hundreds of the people who'd worked for the king, concubines, bodyguards, minor officials, servant girls, and buried them nearby to serve him in the next world. Around the tomb of Jer, the third king of unified Egypt, are the graves of 317 other people, the great majority of them young women. And these were not the king's enemies, they were people he knew. But murdering hundreds of people and burying them with the king is almost normal in the earliest kingdoms. Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, they all did it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Welcome to civilization. But the terrible things they did had a purpose. Terror is a primitive form of mass communication. Put up enough images like this, and you don't have to station soldiers in every village. In Mesopotamia, the first civilizations soon became military empires that routinely impaled the citizens of conquered cities. The glorious soldier holding the severed head of his enemy became the human ideal. And women practically vanished from the record, except for laws destroying their freedom. Wives of citizens who go out on the street must veil themselves. Middle Assyrian laws, 1500 BC. 1/4 of early Mesopotamian laws were about controlling women.
The man wants to make sure that the children are his, and one way of doing it is to regulate, marriage, and to say to the woman, I have to control your movement.
The legacy of Mesopotamia is still visible today in old parts of Cairo. The wealthier houses contain harems where women were segregated in order to prevent social contact with men who were not part of the family.
You have this ideology in architectural form. The house is enclosed by high walls. The male space is on the ground floor so that there's easy access for the male visitors, and the female spaces are on the upper floors where they could overlook these male spaces. It served the purposes of secluding the women from strange male eyes. At the same time, it allowed women privacy to socialize without interference from the males.
Segregating women and making them wear veils were just part of the process of turning women into private property. Women had to wear veils in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. So did respectable women in classical Greece and Rome. Women in medieval Europe were still veiling their hair. And even in our grandmother's time, women still wore veils on special occasions. Today, almost everybody has forgotten that the veil comes from an ancient upheaval that also brought us tyranny and endless war. But it does. Every state echoes the first state. Hierarchy, militarism, male domination.
Today, in this great meeting place and throughout the land, we the people celebrate America. Please welcome President-elect Bill Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, Vice President-elect Al Gore and Mrs. Gore.
Like anybody trying to run a mass civilization, Bill Clinton must get millions of people to pay taxes, work together, obey orders from a distant capital. That's so hard to do that until recently, all mass societies had to be dictatorships. But Bill Clinton doesn't have to be a dictator. He can actually try to talk people into cooperating because he has all the technology of mass communications available to him.
Our country for the American people. To celebrate not a victory of party or persons, but the common ground we call America.
But what was it like before mass media? Go all the way back to ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago. No human being has ever lived in anything bigger than a village. And suddenly here we are in the world's first unified state. And we have a little problem: how to run it. Think of the number of people involved. 50,000, 100,000, 500,000. And remember that the ancient Egyptians, the ancient everybody, lived in a world with no mass communications. No radio, no television, no books, no newspapers. Hardly anybody could even read and write. So they had no way to talk things over as a mass society, no way to reach a consensus, no way to agree voluntarily on what ought to be done. So somebody had to give the orders and everybody else had to obey. When we left the villages, we had to leave equality behind too. A mass society without mass communications has to be a dictatorship. But it doesn't have to go in for militarism, and it doesn't have to destroy women's rights. Egypt was one of the few ancient kingdoms where all the elements of patriarchy did not arrive at the same time. In fact, the early Egyptians, at least, accepted no more of the patriarchal order than they absolutely had to. The very first kings behaved quite badly, but mass society in Egypt did not become a permanent nightmare of exploitation and oppression. As soon as they could, the Egyptians moved away from the terror of the founding times. They even gave up building pyramids eventually and satisfied themselves with more modest temples. In fact, Egypt became the great exception, a mass society that managed to keep a lot of the old village values. And women still had a place both in religion and in the real world.
Before the coming of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, patriarchy was dominant, but it tolerated the presence of goddesses. So we see goddesses juxtaposed to gods in the religious ideologies. The earlier the period, the more dominant the female figure is. In pharaonic Egypt, the queen legitimized the kingship of the ruler.
In Egypt, women owned land and ran businesses. They moved freely in public and were close to being equal partners with their husbands. Occasionally, Egyptian women even ruled the country in their own right. Queen Hatshepsut reigned for 20 years and built this temple. She wore the customary fake beard of the pharaoh on ceremonial occasions, but the Egyptians, by and large, didn't seem to mind being ruled by a woman. Beneath these sands lies the city of Lahoun, briefly Egypt's capital over 3,000 years ago. Nick Millett, the curator of Egyptology at the Royal Ontario Museum, is overseeing the dig.
The sharp contrast that has always impressed me is the difference between the status of women in Egypt and that in, shall we say, classical Greece. The ancient Greeks were a very peculiar bunch indeed, and they were basically terrified of their womenfolk. I don't say that lightly, I really believe this. If you will go over Greek mythology, you will find that almost all the monsters are female, and that must surely mean something. This did not happen in Egypt. A man had his womenfolk around him. This gives the whole court life a kind of a feminine quality. The art shows extremely fine linen garments on the women, through which the bodies show very clearly. Women's clothing particularly, which I have kind of an interest in at this time, it does develop. New styles appear, and in many cases you can date a picture on a tomb wall by the fashions of the moment.
It was not a misfortune to be born a girl in ancient Egypt. Nobody'd even heard of the veil. Why this huge difference between Egypt and other places? Ancient Egypt lived along a river in a desert so wide that early armies couldn't cross it. To the north was open sea. So for almost 2,000 years, ancient Egypt was safe from attack by other civilized states. But Egypt's luck eventually ran out. Around 1600 BC, the first invaders arrived. It was the end of Egypt as the great exception. First came the Hyksos, and then came the Hittites, an even more aggressive lot. And in the course of organizing itself to fight them off, Egypt became like everywhere else. This temple was built over 3,000 years ago by Ramses III, one of the first pharaohs to glory in being a conqueror and a killer. There's the great pharaoh in his war chariot, pulled by horses that look like New Kingdom Harley-Davidsons, trampling the foe underfoot. There's the pharaoh, 10 times larger than life, holding a bunch of doomed captives by the hair. And there are the pharaoh's scribes, counting the severed hands and various other severed bits of his slaughtered enemies. This was when Egypt finally accepted the full patriarchal package. Once other civilizations can reach out and hurt you, you have to militarize. That's what happened in 19th dynasty Egypt, and it had an immediate impact on women.
With the accession of the 19th dynasty, which was a military dynasty under Ramses I, you have the beginning of a new approach, a new presentation of the kingship. They saw themselves as reforming the increasingly effeminate and ineffectual ways of the latter part of the 18th dynasty. We're not like those guys who misruled you before. We are men, we are warriors, we are the new conquering kings of the empire. And they represented their sons in a way that the earlier kings had not. Representations of the royal princes in the 18th dynasty, even the ones who ultimately become king, are very rare indeed. Under the 19th dynasty, you have the boys, rows of them. Ramses II brags of having had 108 sons, and those presumably were only the legitimate ones. The picture in the 19th dynasty is one of increasingly masculine presentation.
Nice guys finished last. The Chinese, the Incas, Mesopotamians, Mayans, Aztecs, even Egyptians, they all went the same way in the end. First a reasonably pleasant and tolerant culture, and then smash. Along comes the local version of the patriarchal revolution, and it's tyranny, slaughter, and oppression forevermore. Which still leaves one big question, maybe the most important one. Why was it necessary in every patriarchal culture to destroy the status of women? How many babies would the average woman have if nobody was pushing her around? It would certainly not be the 6 children that were the norm in our grandmother's generation. In cultures that let women make their own choices, small families are the norm, because women know that children are a lot of work. Big families are a legacy of militarized societies. Military power requires lots of people, especially soldiers. That means lots of babies, especially boys. But you can't get a high birth rate if women are really free to choose. So you have to reduce them to a state where their best hope of security and respect is their children. Or more precisely, their boy children.
Patrilineality, the passing down of possessions and property and name from father to son, means that you must have a son. If you're so unlucky as not to have a boy, this is big trouble. One recourse is to try to attain a boy by, for example, giving your inheritance to a nephew. That obliges him to take care of you and respect you. Women who don't produce sons wind up being destitute for that very reason. You can't afford to alienate your brothers or uncles or any male kin. The source of weakness for women is the fact that they are replaceable, that a man can take another woman instead of his wife. It's not that their functions are replaceable, it's the fact that they are personally, that there are so many other women to choose from.
بس عايزة تتنشفي دكتورة نشفة.
Women try to overcome this oppression by practicing maximum freedom within the space that is allowed to them. They just know the boundaries, they know where not to go, and within that, they have maximum power. ودي اللي كنست ودي اللي لمت
وحضري يا اسطان وحتى صينية
ودي اللي حشت ها واخر واحدة ايه انا عملت ودي اللي تقول زغ 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 ودي اللي تقول زغ 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 يطيب من تحت ومن فوق. Because of women's intelligence, women have created a stake in patriarchy and have tried to play by the rules and get the most out of it. You're not going to upturn the culture, what people write in newspapers, or how the country is ruled. You're not going to change that anyway. I'm talking about making the most out of scarce resources in a culture of poverty that is devalued and doesn't have a voice.
The rulers had to destroy women's freedom to get the birth rate up. They needed men's support to do that. But most men love their mothers and their wives and their daughters. Why would they collaborate in hurting them? Besides, a fully militarized patriarchy was not good news for the average male. For every general, there are thousands of foot soldiers, and being a foot soldier is not good for your health. A few men ended up on top, but most men were less free, less rich, and maybe even less safe than before. So why did men go along with the patriarchal revolution? I suspect that in most places there was an unspoken deal made right at the dawn of civilization. The patriarchs had to buy men's support, and what they had to offer was status. Here was a way to reverse the huge loss of status men had suffered back when we all moved into the villages. Any competent tyrant would spot the raw material for a deal here. So here's an offer you can't refuse. Throw your lot in with us, back patriarchy, and we'll make you superior to all women. You'll have to obey us. But from now on, you'll have control over your women, and you can be certain, well, pretty certain, that they're your kids. What's more, your kids will belong to you, not your wife, and your property will go to your sons, not your sister's kids. Oh, and we'll change the religion, too. From now on, God will be male, and so will all his priests, and they'll all back your new male privileges. Around 2,000 years ago, new religions swept away the old pagan beliefs in almost all the mass civilizations of the old world. The new religions of the Middle East turned the universe into a perfect hierarchy, with a single male sky god at the top. And the goddesses, who always played a major role in earlier religions, were demoted to mere saints, or at best, the mother of the god. Early Judaism, early Christianity, and Islam all segregated worshippers by sex. Their rules for women were patriarchy's rules. And those who interpret God's will, of course, are exclusively male.
In Islam, God becomes much more abstract, as an idea, as a concept. Linguistically speaking, he's referred to as a male god. However, it's really a very abstract concept of divinity, and definitely there's no tolerance of any female divinity there.
In their structure and rules, Christianity and Islam represent the final triumph of patriarchy. Yet the new religions were a paradox, for at the same time they were actually a revolt against inequality, the very core of patriarchy. They proclaimed that all human beings were basically equal, and that's probably why they spread so fast. However little the new religions changed things in practice, they were a sign that people would break with patriarchy if they had the chance. Maybe now we have. The veil has made a comeback in Egypt recently, and fundamentalism is on the rise. But looks can be deceiving.
Even though there is no law that says women should wear the veil in Egypt, we see it all over the Muslim world. You know, why are women wearing the veil, and why are they willingly wearing the veil? We know that some are pressured to wear it. And I think that it's the panicking, the insecurity of patriarchy, and its need to say to women, you should be more controlled.
Patriarchy is right to panic because these young women behave in ways unimaginable to their grandmothers. When they put on the veil, it's not in submission to some 4,000-year-old law. Often it's just a tactic to move outside the house.
ما لبست الحجاب يعني في ناس كتير قوي احترمتني بالحجاب ده على الاقل يعني كان زمان كان في ناس كتير بتبص لي لما ابقى ماشيه المعاكسات وكده فطبعا انا اللي كنت باخد ذنبهم لان انا اللي عامله في نفسي كده فدلوقتي طبعا بعد ما لبست الزي الاسلامي ما لمش نفسي لو حد عكسني انا كده عملت اللي عليا وفي نفس الوقت برضك عدد المعاكسين قل كتير قوي 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 لان الواحد طبعا احترم نفسه في لبسه فاكيد الناس هيحترموه.
The modern economy pulls women into the workforce, and education gives them new ideas. Such rapid change has provoked a fundamentalist backlash. It's the same struggle that started centuries ago in the West, and it isn't over there yet either.
If you put it in perspective, we can say that the new right has become a universal phenomenon. It takes the manifestation of women veiling in this culture. It takes other forms in other cultures. There are fascist movements in other cultures that demand certain forms of behavior. I'm sure there are similarities. I think the world economy is going through a crisis, and people always turn to religion or conservatism, to what they know.
All across the globe, a communications revolution is undermining the old ways. Television's bringing the images and ideas of an emerging global culture to traditional societies. And that's already having an impact on the power balance between the sexes everywhere.
people see a very alien world. Much of it is foreign. It's about places people have never been and will never go to. But people are avid to learn just how un-Islamic the stories can be. One incident was caused by television. 4 young girls decided to escape from the village and go to Cairo and become TV stars. They were, of course, brought back summarily, and they didn't get very far. But this had a great impact on the village, that television can be subversive.
Not this year, not this decade, but patriarchy is slowly collapsing. Even though male hierarchy and privilege still predominate everywhere. Even though every country in the world is still militarized. After 5,000 years, patriarchy is not just in our institutions, it's in our heads. But it is not in our genes. The problem is not human nature. It's that mass societies are still trapped inside the ancient machine they built thousands of years ago to deal with the problems of thousands of years ago. The machine called patriarchy was the only way to run an early mass society. It was refined into both a killing machine and a breeding machine as the early civilizations started fighting one another. And we conquered the whole planet with it, thousands of years ago. But now our weapons have become so destructive that we can no longer afford to fight major wars. And we don't actually have to live in patriarchal dictatorships anymore. Mass communications mean that we can be democratic. Patriarchy no longer makes sense as an institution.
I think we have built enormous monuments to man's domination. There was a photograph of all the new members of Congress, and we were all lined up on the steps. And I was on the top step and ready to have this photograph taken. And 2 of the new members, 2 white males, just at the time the photograph went, they stood in front of me, and I am lost. It's as if I'm not there. It's sort of symbolic. There is no me. And I think I have to learn somehow to be able to move that aside and say, I'm here too.
Photographs like this may one day seem as bizarre as those old pictures of the Soviet leaders lined up on top of Lenin's tomb. And it will be as normal for women to hold power as it is for men to do the dishes.
Let's see, tomorrow we have NARAL.
Nike, the Gay and Lesbian Rights Coalition.
That's right.
Somebody that bought something, a dinner with you at an auction.
That's right, I have to take them to dinner, squeezed in amongst Nike.
Basically, what you do is you eat and drink in this job.
No. You try to avoid both the eating and the drinking, but you look like you're eating and drinking. All right, now I think we're ready.
All right, good night. Good night.
I think I have some passion. Good night.
There's no golden age coming, no happy ever afters, but patriarchy is in retreat on every front. And the vital front is right here, where men and women are changing the most fundamental human partnership. The process is often confusing and painful, but we are changing it, and that's a good reason to be hopeful about the human race. If we can achieve equality between the sexes, then the other big problems like war and nationalism and North-South are not insoluble either. And a century from now, people may have to explain to their kids about patriarchy the way we have to explain about slavery. And wouldn't that be nice?